Okay, welcome everyone. I'm here with Daniel Garner, and we're going to do a little conversation about some of his own work, particularly Belonging Again, which was influenced by Reiff, however we want to pronounce it, I'm not sure. But I've discovered Philip Reiff through Daniel. Very, very impressed with him as a sociologist. And I thought it would be good. We both kind of been talking about him recently on Twitter and back and forth. So I thought it would be good to have a conversation about him and the influence he's had on your work as well. And just the general themes and topics which he touches on. So maybe just for people who don't know who you are, most people watching will, but just in case they don't, you want to briefly introduce yourself and then we'll start talking about Philip Reiff.
Well, Owen, thank you for having me today. I always appreciate your work. Your book on the studies in thymos is excellent. I brought it up like 4 times with Guy Sinstock the other day. It's just a magnificent work, and I think that's such an important topic. And as we said before, you cover a lot of books that a lot of people don't read that are very important. And Triumph of the Therapeutic is one that my heart is particularly attached to. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'm Daniel Garner, part of O.G.Rose, Upham and Garner Rose. We write together, Upham and my wife, and we live on a farm in Virginia, and we write essays. We put out a book recently called Thoughts. Then there's also The Conflict of Mind, book 1 in the trilogy on the truism of the rational, creative writing, short stories, and different things like that. So, and you can find a lot of that at OG.Rose.com. There's YouTube, Amazon, Twitter, and this is where I list out all the other things that you can go and then you can hear me begging for you to like it or something. So, all of these different places that you can go to. So thank you, Owen, for the opportunity.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's go maybe straight into Reiff.
Nice.
Is it Reiff or Reiff?
I've always said Reiff. I have no idea. I'm just a simple boy. You see, I took sign language for a long time, so I don't have to say words. That's how I got out of it. Words are hard. Words are really hard, Owen.
Fair enough. Well, we'll say either one for now. Reiff, Reiff. So I came across Philip Reiff from listening to an interview you were doing. I can't remember who it was with, but I remember you just said Triumph of the Therapeutic, and I thought that's interesting. I'm going to look into that. I Googled it, bought the book a few weeks later, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. So do you want to maybe just give a bit of a background about Reiff and so on?
Well, Philip, so I'll end up saying Reiff because that's what I'm habitually to. I think Philip Reiff was born, I think around 1922, 23. He passed around 2006. He was a premier Freudian scholar, one of the first real big names in that field, but he was also controversial. Because in his book on Freud, he stressed that Freud actually was not totally in favor of the pleasure principle, which is the traditional reading, where Freud is big on the release of libido and the pleasure principle, where Reiff really wanted to suggest, well, actually Freud is a little more tragic, where the reality principle, which is sort of restrictions on what the personal will in the individual, are very important for the social order. This was very innovative at the time, and a lot of people had you could almost say a reading of an early Freud, which you could say emphasizes the pleasure principle, because if you're in a society that really emphasizes the reality principle or restrictions, well, then it would make sense that you would emphasize the pleasure principle, because you need a balance of both. You can have pathologies on either side of the road, if you will. But you see, what Reiff kind of wanted to stress is that emphasis is not exclusion. Even if there are emphases in Freud on the pleasure principle, that does not mean he exclusively thinks that the pleasure principle is the only thing that matters and human fulfillment is found in that. So Reiff's writing really brought out more of this trade-off, more of this tragic. And one of the reasons I was attracted to Philip Reiff when I first encountered him is because I really had not encountered, not that I was widely read in the field, of sociologists, psychologists, people in those fields who were tragic thinkers. I've always done a lot in literature. Harold Bloom, different people emphasize how great literature emphasizes tragedy, and tragedy is a trade-off of competing goods. It doesn't mean just a catastrophe. Martha Nussbaum and The Fragility of Goodness, we'll talk about that. It's a great book where a trade-off is competing goods. If you have more individual liberty, that means you're free to do what you want, but you also have less direction. So the increase of individual autonomy tends to lead to the meaning crisis, as people are talking about today. But if you have too much direction, then that's totalitarian and you're controlled. So how do you find that sweet middle? The entire principle that there was a need for a sweet middle was rather new. And Philip Reiff saw that in Freud and brought that out. The Triumph of the Therapeutic is written in the 60s. I think it's 1966, maybe 1967, something like that, where he's really seeing that culture is going very, very far in the direction of releases away from controls and constraints. And for him, that was going to lead to an anti-culture, as he called it, and he even called it the death works, because for him, a culture is its moral order. Like he has this part toward the end of the book where he says the moral order of a culture is repetitive. All cultures, by definition, have a quote unquote moral order. By that, he means not just like do's or don'ts, but a certain directionality to being, of which makes communal intelligibility to one another possible. And he started to see that the West was going very, very far away from that, which was going to lead to atomization, tribalism, the death of culture. And he even later in his life will talk about living among the death works, I believe is the phrase that he uses. What to me, and then I'll give it back to you, what's so extraordinary about Philip Reiff, he was also at one point, it should be noted, married to Susan Sontag. They had a child named David Reiff, who I've listened to a few times. He's quite intelligent. I really like Miss Sontag, her work on photography, her work on metaphors, illness, all of that is very, very good. And I actually think there are ways to understand what Philip Reiff is talking about in terms of her work on photography, and we can get into that later. But the thing is that's so extraordinary about Philip Reiff for me is I believe he basically is telling you you're going to have a meaning crisis, which is something John Vervaeke talks about. And it's kind of quote unquote a newer idea. And don't get me wrong. I mean, Dr. Vervaeke's framing of the meaning crisis, the way he puts it forth, the practices is all very valuable. But Philip Reiff has in there basically the loss of constraints is going to lead to the inability to have a shared intelligibility, and also an inability to make sense of yourself, because the individual is always made self of within a communal structure. And if there is no possibility of a communal structure, then it will be very difficult for the individual to have any intelligibility for themselves or sense of meaning for themselves. So he predicts that. I think he predicts a lot of the role of power to come in to make up for the loss of that shared intelligibility. And it's an incredibly prophetic book. And the fact that he wrote this in the 60s, and I think it's only become more true of time, is rather extraordinary. So I find it a remarkable text.
Yeah, that was a really good summary. I think what interested me in him at first was this emphasis on the pleasure principle not being the most, like the release of the pleasure principle not being the primary thing Freud was arguing.
Yep.
And I think that Freud may or may not, I'll leave it to like super hardcore Freud scholars. I'm not a super hardcore Freud scholar, but I'll leave it to them to decide whether or not libido, eros is really the center of the human being, of the human nature. But I feel like definitely the kind of the psychology that came out of Freud then from later interpreters often put libido and eros as the absolute center. You're kind of living in this world where theoretically all repression and all misery is based around libido and eros. And then there's other things, there's like thymos and so on, which I'm always talking about, which is kind of in an oppositional position to eros in many ways. And I thought that was an extremely interesting interpretation of Freud. And he also says in one part that it's not libido, but it's ambivalence, which is the thing which Freud is really smart on. And I was like, that makes a lot of sense to me, the kind of ambivalent unconscious versus conscious contentions and so on within people, which Freud really, I think, quite masterfully describes in a lot of cases. So I think that's a really good kind of grounding to why I think he's relevant today as well, because we have had since the 60s, obviously he saw this being writing this in the 60s, a emphasis on appetite of consumption, pleasure seeking and so on as this kind of liberational force, as indefinite liberation. I think what's happened in the past 10 years in particular has this kind of indefinite pleasure seeking and this indefinite individualization of like, you're an individual who has every right to seek all these pleasures, an indefinite horizon of pleasures to seek, has really come crashing down in many somewhat comical and somewhat tragic ways. And I think now that there's a bit of a reevaluation going on with many people. So I think that and also you see Christopher Lasch. We were talking about Christopher Lasch, who's obviously extremely influenced by him. We'll talk about maybe Christopher Lasch a bit later. Yeah, I think he's definitely someone who's very, very relevant to the past 10 years in Western culture.
Well, one of the things that, so a few things. Both Freud, and it would be another subject, both Freud and Foucault tend to be deeply dismissed by conservative thinkers in general. But both of them are indeed, especially the later Foucault, has a lot of tragic elements in the same way that the later Freud, and that's why both of them are actually great thinkers, because they don't take their initial thoughts as gospel at the beginning. They think it through to the end of their life and they keep reevaluating. And whether one at the end of the day agrees with the views of a Freud or Foucault, I personally have always deeply respected someone who reevaluates their work constantly throughout their entire life. And Foucault's an example of that as well. It would have actually been quite interesting if he didn't die so young. I always think about how St. Augustine at the end of his life reread everything he wrote and then wrote retractions. He like wrote a book, like making sure if he still thought the way that he still did and he retracted some things. That's always to me been like the ideal standard. I hope to do that myself, like a retractions book at the like, and you see that in both of them. So it has not helped a proper understanding of Freud, who I'll focus on instead of Foucault, for conservatives to frankly come in and see him as pure liberal libido spirit. That has led to these misinterpretations. And I think Freud reminds me of Plato in the sense of I've been convinced that Plato is very different from Platonists, in the same way that I've been convinced that Freud is very different from the people who claim to be following in the psychoanalytical tradition. And that's why the chapter where Reiff really concentrates on how Freud basically disowns Adler and Jung is so fascinating, because he's like at the point where he's like, that's not even psychoanalysis anymore. And that's really important. And why Freud thought that way, I actually think is a big deal. But anyway, what I think what Freud understood is that if I say, hey, Owen, you can be anyone you want to be, Freud understood that might kill you. Like if I give you infinite choice always creates anxiety. And choice always also says, okay, you can be anything you want to be, so why do you want to do X instead of Y? And most human beings don't know why they want what they want. And they're not sure why they choose what they choose. So they exist in a state of ambivalence, like uncertainty about what they should do or what they should be. The problem is, if I increase options without simultaneously decreasing your ambivalence, then the ambivalence becomes more pathological and overwhelming as your choice is expanding, because the more choice you have, the more you're responsible for not realizing any of those choices. When you don't have choice and you're ambivalent, well, it's not your fault. You don't need to know who you are deeply or how you think, because you're only allowed to say, be the blacksmith. You're kind of forced by your dad being a blacksmith to do that and so forth. So the problem of ambivalence is not so great if there's a limited horizon of choice. But as you have an expanding horizon of choice, the problem of ambivalence becomes all the more pronounced. And this is kind of what Freud, you see, since Freud is going to be talking about the increase of choice, one can take that as saying, oh, he's saying that that's the good thing, right? Well, and Freud is like, well, yes, it's more like Freud is like, the modern world cannot help but increase choice. It's not that I'm necessarily wanting, it's happening. It's going to happen. It will continue to happen. And as that occurs, if the ambivalence of the human being is not addressed, that will prove to be, that will cause a lot of mental illness. I mean, in Freud, there's a real emphasis that it's first world nations that have mental illness and psychological problems. When you're too busy, when you don't know if you're going to have food or water tonight, you know what to do. You have to go find food. You have to go get water. Your choice is made for you by your very facticity. But as the world becomes developed, the problems of mental illness and the need for something like psychoanalysis becomes more pronounced and undeniable, precisely because you have an open horizon of possibility that then you are confronted with the question of what are you going to do faced with that horizon. And that becomes very reflective and very, very difficult. And so I think Reiff is correct to emphasize, and then I'll give it back to you, to emphasize that ambivalence and the need to explore that ambivalence. And I think that's where, and it's another topic, this is where you see people like Dr. Last, or who are connecting Freud with Lacan, then Lacan with Hegel, and you see that in Zizek, how these things kind of go together, because it's the question of ambivalence, which then gets you into the question of what is the ontology of human beings to make possible that ambivalence, and what is the nature of choice, epistemology, by which we deal with those ambivalence. So all those things start to get folded together into the question.
Yeah, this exactly this kind of horizon of furthering choices is interesting, because there's one part in the book where he says that freedom doesn't come with more and more choice. Actually, real freedom comes with feeling like you're chosen.
Yes.
So I love that line. I thought that was absolutely perfect, and that it really summarized my problem with psychology the way it is today. Because I feel like that's what psychology is often doing with people. It's often showing like realize your freedom and your choices, and it's like, yeah, but I do want freedom, but I don't like how you're defining freedom as merely a kind of infinite, a kind of expanding realm of choice. Like, I want to feel like I'm chosen. I have a purpose. I have a and because without feeling like you have a purpose, which kind of makes you feel like you were chosen to do something, it's often hard to endure things which are hard. If you feel like you have a purpose, if you've got a real direction, you can really endure a lot. I think Nietzsche has a quote which says, I can't remember which book it is, but it's something like, if a man has a why, he can endure anything, but if he just has a how, he can endure nothing. It's something, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like this. So I think that it really, this book Triumph the Therapeutic, really predicts a crisis, not just in the culture, but in the kind of mental health structures and so forth that deal with the meaning crisis and deal with misery and deal with and all these mental symptoms and so on. And I think there's one part. Okay, so there's one kind of more theoretical side I think it might be good to go into, and it's the informative versus the transformative distinction, or the kind of classical therapeutics versus the Freudian therapeutics. So I don't know how much you focus on that part, but do you want to maybe explain those distinctions and explain that?
Well, this is critical. So a few things. The distinction you just made about freedom, freedom and feeling chosen versus choice, I think Dante is very good at that. If I were to sum it up, Dante is, for Dante, hell is freedom from order, while heaven is freedom in order. And there's this classical sort of notion that human beings actually feel freest when they're part of something, like a dance. The image that's always used in like traditional theology is a kind of dance. And Dante describes so much of the movement of the birds at one point in Canto 20. I'm not sure, but the movement is always like a dance, because a dance is ordered but free. And that was kind of the perfect symbol of freedom, where there's this, you don't know what's going to happen in the dance, but you're responding to what the other person is doing. They're responding to you. And metaphorically, I do think it would be another subject. Dance is uniquely useful as a metaphor to understand a lot of these topics and balances, because there's the other person you have to respond to, there's a loving there's an order, but there's also a freedom in the improvisation that mixes that order. So dance seems metaphorically to be a very useful metaphor by which to think what the quote unquote ideal or goal is. But today it's purely on the side of freedom is escaping order, but for Dante, that is hell. Hell is a freedom from order, freedom from any principles that demand you to do something outside of your appetite, so what you want to do. And then very importantly in Dante, which I think fits with Reiff here, all of the tortures in hell, like the part in the Inferno where they're on the beach and there's like these flaming pieces of something, I think it's paper or whatever, coals, ash coming. Why paper or ash? Come on, Dan. Ash was coming down from the sky and it's burning everyone on the beach. The ash is actually God's grace. All of the tortures in hell are actually God's grace for people who don't like it. So hell is actually God trying to save you when you hate God. Right? So it actually tortures you, right? And everyone is in hell because they want their appetite outside of that movement of grace to pull them back into order. And that's what you see happening sociologically. Like, once you define freedom as freedom from order, anyone who wants to bring you, say, the order or the constraints that make possible a social, it is those very constraints then that are evil, that are bad. And yet that's the very thing you need to escape the mental health crisis or the meaning crisis that you're in, that you want to escape from, but cannot escape from without the very medicine that you've defined as poison. So you create this very difficult sociological kind of snake eating its own tail that eventually emerges, which I think kind of shows, if we agree with Reiff, that's what you see in the world today. On the distinction between the informative and the transformative, the way I take that is Freud quite clearly The reason he did not like Jung or got very upset with Jung or Jung or whatever we want to say, Mr. J, like the Joker or something, is because he felt like Jung was taking psychoanalysis and using that theory to do the very thing that it existed not to do. And what psychoanalysis for Freud does is it doesn't give you a cure. It doesn't transform you and it doesn't solve your problems. It describes your problem so that you can better understand it and increase your horizon of choice and freedom. Now, of course, that means Freud is in the business of creating more anxiety for you. But the hope is that the very theory of psychoanalysis increases your freedom while also giving you the ability to handle that freedom. For Freud, there is no cure to the human condition. And one of the reasons he did not like Adler or Jung at all is because they were basically taking psychoanalysis and offering a cure. You know, Reiff will talk about how Jung gets the archetypes and everyone can have their own individual mythos. You know, and then a take on the really what's interesting is if we follow like on Reiff or some of the other people, William Rich, I can never say his name, you know, on the idea that you solve it with libido. Well, frankly, that actually kind of, if you really believe that you can find fulfillment via, say, sexual appetite, that actually flies in the face of what psychoanalysis is, because psychoanalysis is a perpetual managing of a problem for Freud. You never solve the human condition. So the funny thing is, the interpretation of Freud as saying that you can find fulfillment by just giving into eros would actually fly in the face of what he defines psychoanalysis as, which is a perpetual management of a problem. That's why that interpretation of Freud is so fascinating, because it actually would then make Freud guilty of the very thing that he critiques Jung of doing, providing a cure when he's only describing, you know, for like the section in the Triumph of the Therapeutic is the analytical. He's the analytical approach, which is kind of step back, describe what you're going through, help you understand it so that you then on your own can figure out what you want to do. So Freud is not promising you any kind of transformation. Freud is providing you with a description to help inform you of who you are so that then you can face yourself better and be able to handle what you see. Where he didn't like Adler or Jung because he felt like they were using psychoanalysis for something more transformative. And that would be to do the exact opposite for Freud of what psychoanalysis is supposed to do. To put it simply, and then I'll give it back to you. For Freud, psychoanalysis is supposed to manage a problem, not solve a problem, where Jung seems to say psychoanalysis can be used to solve a problem. And for Freud, the moment you do that, like he's adamant, Freud is adamant. He's like, that is not psychoanalysis. Like he basically disowns it and separates it. The moment you are offering a cure, you're not doing psychoanalysis. And that's where he's going to bracket out transformative analysis in favor of something that's more analytical, more descriptive.
Yeah, that was a good summary. Also, I think the distinction is on top of that, the classical modality, kind of therapeutic modality, was full participation in a community, which could perhaps be a new community or an extended community. Which kind of fits in again to our kind of sense of feeling chosen and not just choosing, where the Freudian therapeutic model intervened in the sense that it wasn't the full participation. It was a kind of humble detachment, a kind of well-managed detachment. And I think this sort of fits again what we were saying earlier with the meaning crisis and so on, of this indefinite horizon of choice. Not having that transformative power in it, it sort of leaves one feeling quite disappointed and so on.
And let me, and you know, not to interrupt you, Owen, but let me add, Reiff, if I recall, throws in a line that's very interesting. So after kind of bashing Jung for a bit, then he gets to Freud, where he says something along the lines of, he says, Jung, though, understood that you still had the problem of what should man choose. So Freud kind of opens up horizon and says, look, it's not up for me to tell you what you should choose and what you should fit into. But Jung kind of at least understood, and Reiff says something like, as much of his finger was shaking and as unconvincingly as he said it, Jung still understood that you still have the problem, though, of what order should you fit into. Like, if you say psychoanalysis is not transformative, okay, that's fine. But Jung's like, okay, but people still need to be find freedom in an order, right? So if you avoid that and you say make people able to handle choice, this is how I frame the problem. What you're doing is basically it becomes very Nietzschean. You're saying Freud would fit with Nietzsche, and I think Dr. Lass has done great work on this, to say you're open to create your own values, like the Nietzschean child, and so on and so forth. And but the issue is, how do you know what values to choose? Can the majority of people handle it? Can you have a community of overmen who create their own values for themselves because they can handle that radical level of choice? Is that even possible, or must the overman inherently be an individual? You do still have a problem of community, or what does it mean to form the kind of religious level in Hegel's phenomenology of journey that Freud, that Jung understood was a problem, even if perhaps he overreached or didn't go necessarily the best direction. He still understood there was a certain problem there.
Yeah. And I think that the risk, I think, with the indefinite detachment and management modality, we could say, is that it could lead to a kind of perpetual atomization.
Yes.
Because you kind of have to have this humble detachment to the point where you don't invest yourself in a community enough because you know that they're disappointing and they will hurt you and so on. So you don't invest in one. So even if someone goes through a crisis and then they come out the end of it, they're reluctant to then participate in a new search for community meaning and so on, because they've been disappointed before. And what worries me about the kind of modern psychological modality is that this could risk just leading to a perpetual atomization of people, which goes on indefinitely, and then we're all living in a pod, and yeah, and it's like risk aversion. It becomes the main form of life, and that worries me a little bit too. So,
well, what you're getting at, so I think The Triumph of the Therapeutic is a masterpiece. However, Reiff ends up doing something similar to Freud, where he points out a problem, and even says this in the conclusion of the book, where he's like, I've been meaning to basically diagnose the revolutionary spirit and how this is going to be an anti-culture and create death works and different things like that. But he doesn't necessarily tell you what you should do then, because he also says, however, I'm not saying we need to go back to the old world where we had constraints. Okay, Reiff, so hold on now. You're telling me that we have an anti-culture if we don't have any constraints, but you're also telling me that you're not so sure if we need to go back to the old world of constraints. He also, another big point of the book is he believes that cultural elites, elites are supposed to be in the business of passing down culture, maintaining the constraints, the metaphysics and all this of the society, and that he believes the elites in the West today have become they're anti-elites. They actually do the exact opposite of what they're supposed to do. Rather than pass down culture, they mock culture. They make fun of it. They rebel against it, and that elites are dealing with an anti-culture. But then he ends the book not necessarily saying that elites shouldn't do that. So it leaves open kind of a gaping hole, in my opinion. And if you brought up Belonging Again. Belonging Again basically came out of, at the very end of that book, he says something like this. He says, we are yet to have a theory of psychohistorical process. And Belonging Again, and I actually think that's a very big deal. So he's saying we don't have a theory yet of how psychology changes through history, right? How the mind changes through history and how people change. That to me is the missing piece from The Triumph of the Therapeutic that you need to understand how you got here to have any sort of idea of where you should go. And Belonging Again kind of emerges out of an effort to fit Philip Reiff within the development of a psychohistorical process, which now I see has a lot to do with Hegel. At the time in 2016, I did not know about that. It had a lot more to do with, say, the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, and also the big move that I think you need to make. I will talk a lot more, instead of constraints and releases, I like to talk about givens and releases. I think givens is actually what you need to, the language you need to use to get to the psychohistorical process, because people did not, say 200 years ago, experience Christianity so much as a constraint. They experienced it as a given, like axiomatic, like the reality is Christian. In fact, what I think, if I were to critique Reiff, I would say Reiff's mistake is the moment you call it a constraint, you're already talking from a place of release. Like you're calling it a constraint, right? And that has a negative connotation, right? people they don't so much experience it as a constraint, it's a given, it's axiomatic. And I think making this move is how you then fit Philip Reiff with, say, Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, how you fit it with David Hume, how you fit it with Hegel, how you can start to situate the entire triumph of the therapeutics within a broader historical movement that he thinks needs to be done, that I think can start to point out some of those problems that and help us work with some of the problems that you are describing. So again, the big thing I guess you could say, you mentioned belonging again, and it kind of in the introduction, we'll talk about this. And in fact, I have to admit, a lot of times I end up talking about Philip Reiff, mentioning givens and releases, forgetting that the givens is the way I describe it. And he talks about constraints and releases. It's funny how that happens. But I really think that the key to starting to approach the problem you just pointed out, Owen, is by moving it from constraints to releases to givens to releases. And then that starts to situate things differently. Great.
Yeah, I want to go into belonging in more detail, but before we do that, I want to just go over two more aspects of Philip Reiff. The first one is the influence we were talking about this before we started recording, the influence he clearly had on Christopher Lasch. And for people who don't know, I'm sure most people listening to this will know Christopher Lasch. Christopher Lasch wrote a book called The Revolt of the Elites, and he wrote a book called Culture and Narcissism. And I'm not an expert on Lasch, but I know that he's touching upon some of the very similar issues with a elite, cultural elite class who, and there is a distinction Reiff makes between political and cultural elite, but more or less I would say a bit of both. I think it's both political and cultural, but an elite class who want to liberate themselves from the responsibility of what he refers to as communal purpose. And I've again, to rephrase his terminology in my own terms, I've written about this in terms of symbolic inheritance. So we inherit from, you're paying for your parents, grandparents, you inherit a house or some money, but you also inherit an identity, a sense of purpose, a place, a world. There's these other kind of symbolic things we inherit too. And I think that what he's picked up on, which clearly Lasch has picked up on too, is that there's a sense in which it's probably since the 60s, it could have gone back before that, who knows, but it's definitely at least exploded in the 60s, where we have an elite class that wants to liberate themselves from that inherited communal and symbolic purpose. And I think it's having devastating effects on the culture at large, political, even economic, even though we prospered economically in the post-war period. Now that seems to be all turned on its head. Everything's in chaos. And I think it could link somewhat back to this. And I also think that my fear with modern psychology here too, which is relevant to Reiff, I'm not so sure how much with Lasch, but definitely with Reiff, is psychology as a way for the elites to liberate themselves from inherited purpose. So for example, I feel guilt because I had an affair. I go to, you know what I mean? I go to a therapist and I say, and they pay them, and then they go, okay, well now you're relieved of your guilt and you go on your way. It's almost a bit like the really vulgar forms of indulgences, which the Catholic Church would give the people through confession and so on. I fear that, I don't think all psychology has done this, and I certainly think psychoanalysis is a very sophisticated form of psychology, which I'm not trying to dismiss it in any way in some vulgar terms. It's all just guilt appeasement. I don't think that, but I fear how psychology can retain some sort of restraints from being turned into this by the larger political and cultural forces around it.
Well, one of the things that Reiff is certainly concerned about, and that's where he's critiquing Lawrence, William Reich, and Jung, is the notion of psychology just becoming purely therapeutic, purely release. There's always been a concern, say, when people critique Christianity, where they say, oh, well, if you believe in a God who's going to forgive you no matter what, then you can do whatever you want and God will just forgive you, right? There's this concern about that. Bonhoeffer in The Cost of Discipleship will make a distinction between costly grace and cheap grace, where he'll say, costly grace is where, you get grace, but you take seriously that Jesus died on a cross and you have to do the same thing. It really calls you out. And you could say it's very thematic, actually. Where cheap grace is you do whatever you want and then you say a prayer afterwards and you're forgiven and you're going to heaven, right? So cheap grace is really bad, and he views cheap grace. Basically, what Bonhoeffer warns is that cheap grace is destroying Christianity. Like if you have cheap grace, then it's over. It's only a matter of time before it's done. Well, basically that's what ends up happening in that can happen in therapy. And really the funny thing is when you throw out Christianity in fear of, like you say, we need to get rid of Christianity because it enables evil, there's a lot of cheap grace. Well, actually then everything becomes cheap grace, actually. You get rid of, you no longer have even the possibility of costly grace. It's just all cheap grace. And that's what Philip Reiff saw was occurring. And Freud saw, was one, it kind of saw what Jung and different people were doing. And of course, Philip Reiff makes that little point where he says, sure, as obvious as it is that Freud was intellectually superior to Jung, according to Reiff, he's like, Freud really underestimated the power of the archetypal structure to attract people and for them to latch onto it because of its therapeutic nature. We tend to think that the ideas that win are the ones that are most true or best, but that might just be a story we like to tell ourselves. The ideas that tend to win in the spread tend to be the most therapeutic ideas. And precisely one of the reasons why you needed, that he kind of points out, one of the reasons these constraints or givens, as I call them, that religions provided or society provided were so important because they held back therapeutic ideas from totally dominating. Because even if you wanted to believe you could sleep around all you want, you knew there was a God that said you couldn't. So, you had to hold yourself back, blah, 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 blah. Well, when you don't have constraints at all, basically the only ideas that will prevail are the quote unquote therapeutic ones, are the ones that make you feel good. Because if you can't have certainty, that's opposed, you can't have certainty, then how do you decide what ideas are true versus what ideas are not true? If at the end of the day, after say a Kurt Gödel and incompleteness theorem, if you can't get a transcendental grounding for ideas, what is your heuristic for determining what ideas are the ones you follow and which ones you don't? Well, guess what? It tends to be confirmation bias. Guess what? It tends to be therapeutic, and that gets unleashed. And then I don't think it's by chance you have a million tribes, conspiracies, everything spreading it's all just basically what you see is a war of the pleasure principles is what's going on. It's just a giant war of the pleasure principles, and there's no way to stop it. Yeah. And so what has also occurred is basically the elites have used psychology, not psychoanalysis, if we keep that distinction. Nobody wants anything to do with psychoanalysis. Everyone wants everything to do, everyone wants everything to do with psychology, which is general. I know I'm not saying that there are not good psychologies, but if we just hold that distinction, you could say psychology is Rousseauian, whereas psychoanalysis is much more tragic, much more of something that's going to be trade-offs of good and evil, something more, you could say Hobbesian, but that might be a little too much, but something more of humans don't, the category you need, this is where I do think Lacan is useful, where humans are constantly in the business of avoiding the real. Does that make them Brutus and evil? Yes, no, because they will kill people to avoid the real, but mostly we're in the business of avoiding the real through self-deception and avoidance and red herrings and whatever. And that is what Freud is really, really bringing out, and that the pleasure principle left to its own devices unconstrained will eventually consume itself to the point where it must confront the real. And when that occurs, it will be destroyed. You can't handle it precisely because you followed the pleasure principle to the real, which means you do not have the intellectual, subjective, psychological resources to handle the encounter of the real. So that will be a really bad moment. Where the psychoanalytic is preparing you for that. But screw that. If you're the elites and you decide what's taught, and also you don't have anything forcing you to go into psychoanalysis, and instead you could just go into psychology, well, that's what you're going to go. That's what the elites are going to do, because the elites are the top of the hierarchy, right? And if you don't believe in God, there's nothing above that hierarchy. So you're the top of the hierarchy. So you set the parameters, and you as subjects yourself are naturally inclined to do what is more therapeutic and pleasure principle than otherwise. So then the elites start to do that, and then it trickles down to everyone, of course, because if the elites are doing that, then the whole reason you're climbing the capitalist ladder is to get to the place where you can be pure therapeutic as well. So this is what Reiff understood. What the elites do tends to be what quote unquote trickles down to the rest of the society, and without a metaphysical order that is even over the elites, that they themselves have to find freedom in as opposed to freedom from, well, then they're human beings as well, and it's only natural for them to go in the direction of the therapeutic. And then that has the widespread impact. And before I give it back to you on Christopher Lass, I like Mr. Lass very much. I think a lot of his books are outstanding. He does seem to be heavily influenced by Philip Reiff. I believe he, in younger presentations, references Mr. Reiff. And I do think Christopher Lass is wonderful to read to come into Philip Reiff, especially if you get into Reiff's like trilogy, that's a bit more academic in different things. It kind of helps you understand what Philip Reiff is interested in. So I think Christopher Lass is useful for that.
Yeah, fantastic. That was a really good comparison of psychology being Rousseauian and psychoanalysis being at least more Hobbesian.
Yes.
Because if civilization on its discontents, Freud has a kind of Hobbesian kind of schema there of kind of monogamous, standard monogamous marital norms being a kind of a part of a collective sacrifice trade-off to avoid perpetual conflict. So that there's a lot of themes there. Where was I going to go with this? I think maybe we'll wrap up with Reiff shortly and we'll go on to blogging again soon. But I just wanted to also point out that another reason I think all of this is so crucial is because I think we can't understand health today. And I think this is something that we both touch upon is a reevaluation of like, what is health? And like it's not just this kind of biomechanical thing where you go to the doctor and they say, take these pills and you have a surgery and so on. I mean, there is that kind of health too. I mean, I'm not saying if you break your leg that this is a sociological issue. It's not. You have to go to a doctor and get a cast in your leg, right? But with stuff like mental health, with stuff, I think even stuff like chronic pain or chronic fatigue, these weird chronic issues that people have today, and all this kind of obscure stuff, and just general health, I think it's something we really need to reevaluate with these things in mind. For example, like this revolting elite who want to betray any symbolic inheritance and don't want any restraints on them, and then all of a sudden that's a terrible way to live, which kind of goes against the kind of like well-formed notion of a mature adult, which then leads to health crisis, and then this gets mimicked through celebrity and media with the general population, and then they start doing these they start behaving in certain ways, which is really bad for them. And there's this general kind of cultural crisis which seems to have stemmed from it. And I think that one of the dangers for me is, particularly when the technology gets more advanced into like biotechnics and stuff like that, is for us to just have a kind of indefinite trajectory as a completely failed trajectory that Lash and Reiff are pointing out, of like infinite comfort, infinite pleasure seeking, the pleasure principle, wars of the pleasure principle, as you were saying, and never learning from it. But we don't have to learn from it because we have such advanced and sophisticated medical technology, which we can just use as a crutch. We don't need to really encounter, hold on, this is all wrong, let's reevaluate, because we can just use pills. We can, and then later on with biotechnology, who knows how we can mess around with chemical structures to avoid the symptoms of all this stuff. And I think the atomization as well of like avoiding seeing the social destruction is pretty much the same thing as you taking those pills all day to avoid seeing the symptoms, your individual symptoms of your own health and so on. So I think there's a real fear of a kind of medical dependency, which is going to, which could emerge out of a failure to reevaluate on these terms. So I'll just give it over to you about any comments on health and so on. And also that, and then I just want to ask you then briefly about, we were saying why people like Reiff aren't very popular and aren't very well known. And then we'll move on to belonging again, but maybe just a few comments on that first.
Well, first off, I'm happy to talk about Philip Reiff for about 6 hours because nobody talks about Philip Reiff. So there's no hurry at all, my good man. And I think health is actually a fantastic angle to bring into this. There's a real sense in which everyone in hell has great health. No one ever dies. But we would not say that having good health in hell is great, right? We all understand that the value of health is completely contingent upon the environment that one has good health, right? One would prefer to have good health in heaven as opposed to in hell, right? It's funny as well, because if you ask the average person, do you want to live to be 500 years old? Most people would say, ooh, that sounds rough, right? They have this kind of sense that like timelessness is a problem, right? And yet that is not necessarily reflected in our thinking about health, because our health is like, if it elongates life, if it makes you feel better, then it is inherently good. Now, of course, there is something to be said. This gets in, like you've talked about with latches, this balance between courage and stupidity, right? Like if you literally could take a pill and not die tomorrow because you took that pill, it would be pretty stupid not to take that pill unless you had really good reason not to take that pill. You see what I'm saying? So there's always a balance, but right there speaks to the necessity of individual discernment in an individual circumstance to determine, like for yourself, what you think is best and when you should take the pill and when you shouldn't, or so on and so forth. That to me would also get to the question of health is actually very much linked up with one's quote unquote common life, as David Hume would talk about, and the individual circumstances. And it actually would only be from one's communal and individual life by which you can determine what is healthy, what is, people would talk about what is good for the community, the life of the community, the health of the community, the health of the family. There's metaphorically, you'll see
body politic as well.
Like language of health is not restricted to the individual agent. But the issue is when you have a zeitgeist of the therapeutic, then basically well-being is individual well-being. And it becomes very difficult. You see, here's the thing though, if the individual is the standard according to which health is determined, well, you can't even determine health unless the individual is alive. So everything has to be about keeping the individual alive, right? For good and bad, because that's the very standard by which you determine what is good health from bad health. Well, that creates a kind of conundrum because you need the standard to determine good or bad health, which means you will make certain decisions that are not going to be considering the secondary question of good or bad, right? So you end up practically having a preservation of a standard so that you can make decisions about health that you never get to making those decisions of, because you're always trying to maintain the sustainability of the standard, of which, by the way, may result in a decline of the communal interaction, the communal setting, or different things like that, because what is individually good for you and your health may not be individually good for other people. And then you get this kind of everyone is against everyone else. And that creates some problematic communal dynamics or different things. Because you can even think about it in terms of food. Like, let's say we have an economic downturn, which is looking increasingly likely. I hope I'm wrong. And there are food shortages, right? Well, if you think in terms of the health of the community, you may think in terms of what can we do to make sure that everyone in the community has food? Well, under the therapeutic zeitgeist, you start thinking, what do I need to do to have food? Not because here's the key though. It's not necessarily because you're an egotist. It's because you are so naturally habituated to thinking in those terms that that's just naturally the first thought. Like, what do I need to do to get food, right? As opposed to what do I need to do to be part of the community to make sure the health of the community is maintained. And this is where, there's a part where Reiff says something like, psychology had replaced ontology. We don't believe in ontology anymore. We believe in psychology. Ontology traditionally was the situating of the individual in a shared order. So basically it means you're not healthy unless your community is healthy too. Unless you all get out of this together, you're not doing well. Now, of course, you can go too far and then you get the kind of communist, socialist, totalitarianism where you're sacrificing the individual for the collective. But there's a big difference between the collective of your neighbor and the collective of the abstract state in Washington, D.C. So there are a bunch of different distinctions that have to be made there. And that's where then you have to get into like belonging, because what are the differences between those social orders or different things? So there is definitely a very different conception of health when you're talking about pure therapeutic or health relative to an ontological conception of human beings as, say, made in the image and likeness of God. So I keep using Christianity. We'll talk about that. Well, basically, then you're not healthy unless you know the gospel. You're not healthy unless you're adopting orphans. You're not healthy unless, say, you're avoiding lust, right? So health gets kind of tied into an entire practice of orders. And you could have really, really good, say, physical health. You might be fit, you might exercise every single day, but in a Christian schema, you could still be unhealthy because you're committing adultery, right? Or that you're stealing from someone, or you're not taking care of the poor. So you see the conception of what constitutes being a healthy human being has gradually over the century, over time, become about individual health and individual well-being, as opposed to well-being as well-ordering. You could say that in the past, you were not healthy unless you were rightly fit in a certain order of things, of which was relative to beliefs. Now, of course, The danger of that is the order you fit into is Nazism, and now you're throwing Jews, now you're committing the Holocaust. So there's always a danger, because the very order, the moral order, can be the thing that causes the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about. But without the moral order, there's a gradual movement to the individual that becomes very difficult to escape, because the individual then becomes a kind of prison. Like all there is the individual, and all there is you. And for someone who can write, someone who's able to be the Nietzschean child, this is great because they create their own values and they're able to rise to the occasions, but it makes it difficult to have a social order.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it made sense. I think especially the fact that the individual is kind of the standard we measure health by in the modern society, within modern medicine, it became the standard. So I think that's something I find it hard to even wrap my head around, but
right.
I think that it's definitely something that we're going to be encountering more as time goes on. And of course, there's a kind of risk with this talking about like collective health, because then if, for example, like the Nazis and stuff talked about the parasite within the body politic and all this, and there is a danger. I think one of the reasons we're scared to talk about health in beyond merely being measured by an individual is because we have bad experiences in the past of that.
But that's perfect if you want to get into belonging again, because that's exactly right. You see, this is where it's actually exactly, this is where belonging again picks up, because I think there's a lack of the psychohistorical process. That's what Reiff doesn't describe, and I want to describe why the therapeutic triumphs. It's for good reason, even if the result is bad. And you see, you have to follow that development. So we're more than free to get into that if you like.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go into belonging again then.
Okay.
So
great.
We'll go straight into it. So you've written a essay series.
Yes.
Is it a book or is it an essay series?
Okay, so it's a book called Belonging Again, but also the main essay that's like super long is Belonging Again. So I'm trying to be as confusing as possible, Owen.
Okay, fair enough. But well, it's the internet age. We're all writing essays and making videos and having books and ebooks. It's just confusing. It's a kind of chaos of media. You know what I mean? It's a chaos of media forming.
Indeed.
Days. But that's just the age we're in. So I think that book is being very much influenced by Reiff, among other people too. And could you tell us what was your motivations with it? What themes do you touch upon? What issues do you touch upon?
Excellent. Well, thank you, Owen. And Belonging Again was written in 2016. So I read The Triumph of the Therapeutic in 2016. And immediately between December 2016 and March 2017, wrote Belonging Again. I also wrote a fiction novel that is basically the creative writing version of it, called To Turn the World. And the Belonging Again, so like you said, it started off as an essay and then it got to page 200. And I'm like, oh, okay. So it was an essay, and then around it, it's become a book, and it's probably a book that will be part 1 and part 2, because we're also going to talk about the legitimization crisis with Habermas, go through all of Charles Taylor, Secular Age, and all of his other books, and it's different things. And then kind of what is the implications of, say, Philip Reiff on metamodernity, and how does that tie with Hegel, and so on and so forth. The reason the book was written is because at the end of The Triumph of the Therapeutic, Reiff says we still need a theory of psychohistoric process, like a theory by which psychology develops, or the human mind. And that's not what The Triumph of the Therapeutic is. You could say The Triumph of the Therapeutic is more of a diagnosis of the current state of affairs. And to me, the revelation of it was this tragic character of society, where you need constraints, but if you have constraints, they can be overly oppressive. But if you have pure release, then that can cause pathologies and different things. So there's a tragic sociology. There is this question of, why is Philip Reiff not known? Why is he so unknown? Some people know him as a great Freudian scholar, but also he's not well known. I think it's because he's a tragic sociologist. I don't think people like tragic, which is a trade-off of competing goods. They either want to have you be a hardcore conservative or a hardcore liberal. And anyone who's going to be saying, well, it's a little of both, nobody wants anyone to do with that. And generally speaking, people who have read Reiff tend to be conservative. And then if more sociology departments on colleges are liberal, well, they're not going to teach that. And then the average person doesn't tend to read sociology. So then like who's going to read it, right? So Philip Reiff, the other ones that the book talks, belonging again, we'll also get a lot into Peter Berger, who I think is a genius, James Hunter at the Advanced Cultural Institute. He wrote a great book called To Change the World Before the Shooting Begins. He has a bunch of excellent texts. And all of those kind of come together to create a tragic sociology. But you see, the main thing that I wanted to do with Reiff is that, you know, a minute ago we were just talking about health, individual health, and you've brought it up, and it's very important. One of the reasons we moved away from, say, communal health is because you had totalitarian regimes talking about the health of the state and oppressing individuals, right? Like one of the things when we talk about the psychohistoric process, we moved away from constraints for good reason. They were used to oppress minorities. They were used to say that all men are equal, but African Americans are not men, or that women can't own property, right? Like moral orders that make possible, finding freedom in that moral order also necessarily exclude. This is the problem. You cannot have an order unless there is exclusion. But the moment there is exclusion, there is risk. And unfortunately, you have a long history of the people being excluded, being oppressed, and minorities, and all of those different things. So then we moved away from that because of the great trauma, especially of Nazism, you know, the great trauma of World War II and these kind of extreme movements where we don't want to do that again. So we moved to a release to make sure there were no constraints on how people operated so that power couldn't use those constraints to control them. But in doing that, removed the organizing principle necessary for there to be a culture. And if there is no culture, then people tend to become existentially anxious. And when they're existentially anxious, totalitarianism becomes very appealing. This really comes out in Philip Reiff's last, I believe it's his last book, which also ties into the question of elites, called Charisma, which is actually an excellent text where he really sort of stresses that the anti-culture of pure release tends to create an existential stability in which everyone longs for a strong man. And you're going to have a rise of like a turn to these big, whether it be the mobs that are going to stop all of the social injustice, or whether it be the popularist leaders. You know, basically that's what ends up happening when you have a lot of existential anxiety. But then the alternative is to have the very constraints and oppressions of which strong men use to control people or to oppress minorities. So belonging again emerges out of that tension of, oh my gosh, how do you organize a society between the ditches, those two ditches? The main switch that belonging again does, that I think really helps fit Reiff, and I mentioned this earlier, into a psychohistoric process, is to talk about givens and releases as opposed to constraints and releases. Because a given is axiomatic, and it's just how the world is. It's not a constraint to you. It just is the case that you don't have sex until you're married. It just is the case that you do not steal. It's just axiomatic. It's not something constraining you. Of course, it's practically constraining you, but you do not phenomenologically experience it as a constraint. A given is something you are thoughtless about. Thoughtless does not mean stupid. It means something you do not think about. You just assume and operate according to. And successful social orders require those givens that you just occupy. And here's the thing though, the moment you realize that a given is in fact just a given, it is assumed as opposed to is, well, then it no longer functions. It has lost the ability to bind you thoughtlessly because now you realize it is something you assume. And once that occurs, then it's chosen. Then Christianity is something you choose as opposed to something that is. Oh, dang. Well, that means Christianity is now an expression of the therapeutic. And that's what's happened now. You see, everything now after, say, Gödel, this is what after Gödel, after kind of the understanding of the impossibility of a transcendental grounding, once the general public becomes conscious of that, say the development of Hegelian spirit through time, that is why you get the loss of constraints, not merely because people just want to have their appetites, but the impossibility of a transcendental grounding makes it to where you cannot have givens. And if you cannot have givens, then that means you can only have constraints, and that are as constraints, and are constraining you. And why should they constrain you if God doesn't exist and there is no transcendental grounding, right? What authority do they have? Because right now you have the crisis of authority. And people are only generally willing to constrain what they want to do if they believe that the ones constraining them have authority to do so. And where does that authority come from if there's no transcendental grounding? So for me, you have to describe givens in order to understand the psychohistorical process. And that's what belonging again generally, and then I'll give it back to you. Belonging again is trying to be the psychohistoric theory that Philip Reiff at the end of the book suggests is needed, and incorporate Philip Reiff in the context of your Berger, your Taylor, and now today I would say Hegel, because I actually think Hegel is a lot of that psychohistoric theory, just was not understood at the time as such. So belonging again is an effort to bring that into a more historic movement and to show how it develops while dealing with the tragedy of how the very constraints that Reiff is warning we're losing, how those were moved away from precisely because they were used to oppress and to control. But of course, that then presents a very big problem for us today, because what does it mean to regain the constraints that you need with the cultural collective knowledge that constraints can be used to give you fascism, totalitarianism, racism, and all of those different things. So it creates, it's framing that different problem and then going forward with it.
Yeah, that's great. I like this idea of tragic sociology. It's a really good term. It's a really good genre. It kind of reminds me of like thinking when you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's no kind of pragmatic and objective solution. Choose X, choose Y, choose the progressive solution, choose the conservative solution. You're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, basically. I think that also the thing about today is that I think that we're learning that this indefinite, as we were saying, this trajectory of this kind of therapeutic trajectory of indefinite cultivation of individuals, indefinite horizon of choices and pleasure and so on, is a problem, because it's, as you said, it's going to also lead to a very bad call for restraints. It's going to lead to a very dangerous call for restraints and constraints, because it doesn't know how to deal with constraints, and then therefore it's going to hit a crisis and then just ask for whatever is in front of it. Whoever's in front of it will immediately be called upon. It reminds me a little bit of Matthew Crawford. I'm always talking about Matthew Crawford.
Yeah. Soulcraft, Shopcraft, dude. I like that. Yeah.
Because he has a book on driving, and he says the funny thing about driving was that it used to be very difficult. So it like in terms of skill, in terms of like your car would be difficult to maneuver. You'd be driving on very bumpy ground. It was something that he makes the equivocation to like driving a BMX or like a kind of mountain bike on like a off-terrain road. You have to use a lot of concentration. You have to, it's dangerous. There's risk involved and so on. And then as you go on through, and I think the consumer market is a part of this cultivation of individuals and pleasure seeking and so on, you get like user-friendly everything. You get a sort of user-friendly model of driving, of consumption, or dating, like dating apps. It's all user-friendly. And in this user-friendliness, you develop a subject that is so incapable of dealing with contingencies and risk and danger that it calls upon the kind of technologies to eliminate all the risk, make it as safe as possible, which then makes you more useless, which then means you call upon more technological safety nets and so on and so forth. So it reminds me of this, just of this kind of something which is definitely in the spirit of our time, which is being stuck between a rock and a hard place. If we keep going the direction we're going, we're not only going to go nowhere, we're actually going to end up with the things that we're trying to avoid by going in this direction to begin with. So yeah, just a few comments on that.
No, that's outstanding. Philippe, Dr. Nicholas, who I adore, he recently had a piece where he said, philosophy, one of the primary characteristics of true philosophy is not thinking the subject-object divide. Where say you don't think according to that, you think beyond that, where you realize subjects and objects are always informing one another, that you're really examining how consciousness experiences objects, but you're kind of avoiding unnecessary dichotomies, if you will. For me, a lot of like true soft sciences, whether it be economics, sociology, or different things, does not think problem and solution. It thinks problem management. And that's, another thing you could say that Freud is in the business of problem management, whereas he accuses Jung of being problem solution. And so, for me, a tragic sociology is really what you have to think, in the same way that I think you have to think economics tragically in order to think it well. And you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think you also put, I love Matthew Crawford, the Sopcraft, the Soulcraft book. He has some others. And there is a great irony where precisely when you make things safer, people know they're safer, so they're more careless and there's more death, right? In the same way that once givens become constraints, then it seems very difficult for people to create constraints for themselves again without doing so out of racism or xenophobia or something bad. It seems very difficult for people to create constraints that don't go in a bad direction, but are actually like rightly ordered, because when you no longer have givens, it seems to be very natural for human to define constraints in terms of us versus them. Because what other constraint do you have? If the individual is the standard of everything, then there's this, and then where my skin is where I end, and then there's you. So there's the contrast. And so the you is the constraint. And of course, I'm not going to make people like me the constraint, because then they're like me, and I'm not going to make myself constraint. So you tend to make an us versus them dynamic, right? And of course, constraints can create, givens can make us versus them as well. But what's interesting is that ironically, we kind of don't want to go back to old symbolic systems because it creates, tribes and us versus them. And yet that's precisely why we can today end up in us versus them dynamics. In the same way that the user friendliness makes things more dangerous because we're more careless, in the same way that us being so adamant about not having an us versus them dynamic actually ironically creates a situation where we end up creating an us versus them, precisely so that we can give ourselves definition as a group. Whereas, say, what's interesting, if you look, again, I just keep making examples of Christianity, like Christianity is like, yes, there are Christians and there are non-Christians, but guess what? Everyone's a sinner. Everyone has some sort of common ground of being imperfect that you have to be open to. Oh, and by the way, don't forget, you didn't save yourself. Jesus saved you, right? So there's a humbling there. There's a shared ground that has an openness. And so you can never go too far into thinking of yourself as better than other people, or else you're, say, committing the sin of pride. It is very difficult now for people to create a communal identity that has a boundary that is able to do that kind of gymnastics. That kind of metaphysical gymnastics seems very, very difficult, precisely because there's only the finite, right? So if you're, say, committing the sin of racism, well, that's you, right? It's not, you can't really divide you in the body from the soul or the spirit. You can't divide those things. So it actually becomes more difficult to, say, be open to difference. Ironically, precisely from a therapeutic place where you believe that you overcome difference more. Actually, difference can become more pronounced precisely because you can't divide people as readily from who they are from what they do, which of course can be dangerous because that could create the cheap grace where you say, yeah, I know I'm a racist, but God forgave me of my sins, so it's okay. That's really bad. But there's also the part of it where when you get rid of that, then everyone today is actually engaging in cheap. We said that earlier, right? When you get rid of the cheap, costly divide that Bonhoeffer talked about, then everything is cheap today. You actually see some of that occurring in a different way.
Yeah, fantastic. One of the kind of themes you seem to touch upon in Belonging Again is how to have real values without leading to, I suppose, sectarian conflicts. If we have communal identities and values that we actually believe in, we seem to go, there's a risk of sectarian conflict. But then if we have these kind of really watered down, hyper individualized values, then they're not really values. They don't really do anything. They're kind of they're kind of like the way Reiff was talking about Jung's moving into like a kind of curator of personal archetypes and myths. You kind of go to a museum and you pick your personal archetype, but you don't really have a kind of world to place it within. So it seems to me that it's again between stuck in a rock and a hard place, because we're needing to form some sort of collective communal sense of place and purpose. And I think exactly because the technology as well is so disruptive and we're so atomized, and I don't know where I am. I'm on a computer talking to someone in a different country, and I'm working from home talking to someone else from a different country, and I don't talk to my neighbor, and I don't have any sort of collective sense of place. How do we have a kind of sense of place without it leading to I suppose I suppose the question is like this: do we inevitably have to take the risk, have to take the kind of leap of faith that there may be conflict? We're not going to live in a world of ultimate peace and prosperity. There may be conflict because we need these more visceral, more stronger communal senses of place and identity.
Well, that's a tremendous question. That's like the $10 billion question. So a few things. One, belonging again, we'll try to explore all these different angles of, say, can you find belonging in career? Can you find belonging? Because a lot of this is tied to the question of belonging. Like when people don't have community, they don't feel like they belong and they don't have an order to fit into. So for me, when we talk about belonging, you're talking about community as well, or connectability. Now, of course, there's the question of, if you have, say, net conversations every Thursday, can that form a kind of community and belonging that is equivalent to or enough like, say, going to the Lions Club or to the Boy Scouts or different things that Robert Putnam will talk about in Bowling Alone? You know, that's a question that we are discovering. And it does seem like it can have certain effects based on how it is structured. So, you know, can you find belonging in career? Can you find belonging in, say, returning to religion? Can you find belonging in, say, fighting against an injustice? Can you find belonging in national sovereignty? On and on and on and on. You know, you have to go through each one of these different. Can you find it in the creative act and go through all of these different things? You know, I recently talked with Guy Senstock about where it seems like today you need a certain way to organize community, and it's more now like a structure of a circle where you circle the same place, you show up every Thursday at the net, or you show up having these regular conversations. There's not the same diner you visit every Friday, but there's everyone, say, doing their own private intellectual work that creates a common core that everyone relates to, that then makes them have relatability and make them feel like they're part of something, even if they're not part of it in the same way, say, they used to be part of the Boy Scout or different things, you know, and then of course you have to ask questions like, is something lost in that when it's done digitally as opposed to when it's done in person, tactilely, or different things like that? And those are questions, you know, it's always, that's the funny question when you say, oh, these kids today play so many video games, you know, they're going to be a mess, you know, the older generation. And then people today be like, oh, they're always on cell phones, it's going to be a mess. And yet the kids are okay. But then there are times where actually it does seem to be a problem, because there does seem to be a difference between, say, the AI as opposed to, say, the car. It'd be like, oh, those kids, they don't have to learn how to use a horse anymore because they could just drive everywhere. You know, that doesn't seem as severe as, say, certain internet or AI technologies. But then you have to explore each one of those things one by one by one. I think the problem of creating values that simultaneously don't set you up for the banality of evil, and bringing in Hannah Arendt's banality of evil is another reason why talking about givens as opposed to constraints is useful, because then you can see how between givens and releases, it's the risk of the banality of evil, where everyone is just thoughtlessly doing their everyday lives, as Hannah Arendt talks about, which just happens to be Nazism, as opposed to releases, which is the French Revolution, where you tear down everything that's oppressing you, but then you get the anxiety of that. So those, you got to find how to create values between those. For me, that is where you end up getting into, say, Hegel. You get into the question of absolute knowing, the limit on things that can know, where you learn to come to terms with that. That gets into Freud on the psychoanalytical, where you see that even if you don't believe in God, there is some certain limit to finitude that we all share, that you have to humble yourself before, that you have to understand yourself as a subject. To me, Philip Reiff leads into the question of Hegel, which then leads into the question of intrinsic motivation, which to me, it actually all comes down, a lot of this for me comes down to the question of intrinsic motivation, which seems to be the ability to create values with other people who are intrinsically motivated, that are creating something that then, because it is a creative act, is something that binds you, but it's not given in the same way that creates the banality of evil. So you have a commonality that's more of a future oriented in a creative act, where other peoples are working on different things, that you can share community in that, as opposed to something in the past that doesn't seem to be an option, because again, you have to choose. Like you necessarily know you are choosing your metaphysical givens. Well, the moment you know you're choosing them, they don't function as givens, because you know you chose them, so they're arbitrary, right? So the question on the new values today, that is the $1 million one, and that's where it gets into the entire onto-epistemology for me of where belonging again gets into the true isn't the rational. It gets into the absolute choice with Hegel. It gets into the fate of beauty. I think aesthetic philosophy is a big deal with this, like I talked with Ethan Nelson about. It gets into all those subjects, and that's always the fun of this, right? Like you find this, okay, Philip Reiff, it leads us to this question of how do we create values? And that gives you 9,000 pages of other things you have to think through. Isn't it fun? Isn't it great? I do think, as just an ad, and then I'll give it back to you. I definitely think there has to be more of making a real choice and a real commitment to a real common life that does have limits and reality to it, that can create the possibility of conflict precisely because you're doing something real that other people may disagree with. I don't think you can ever escape a world of possible disagreement and conflict unless you create everyone in like a VR chamber, which seems to be what we're doing, right? I mean, we seem to be heading in a kind of technological world where everyone can be happy in isolation. And if they're all happy in isolation, no one's going to butt into one another and create conflict. So those seem to be basically the choices. Either one comes to learn to be comfortable with a certain level of possible conflict and risk, or you enter into an artificial environment where you're totally atomized, but you got your video game, so maybe it's okay. So the pure therapeutic seems to be indeed tied up with the purely technological man technique. Those things definitely seem to go together.
Yeah, perfect. Just to point on the restraints which common being, common belonging and stuff put on us, I think that I quoted Fight Club the last conversation we had. I'm going to do it again now. Yes. The quote where he says, "Without pain, without sacrifice, we have nothing." And I always loved that because it was so liberating from the kind of safetyism and the kind of overly therapeutic disposition of, I think, late capitalism, end of history in this general world. Because it's true. I mean, in order to have a sense of being, in order to have a form, in order to have especially a common form, there is limitations, there is constraints, there is sacrifice. In order to achieve anything, there's suffering, there's pain involved. And I think we're kind of given the injunction in kind of late capitalist, or however we want to call it, postmodern late capitalist, end of history kind of society, that we should be able to have everything we want. And then once you realize that we should have everything we want is actually a route towards nothingness rather than a route towards something great, you can say, oh, no, these sacrifices are necessary and so on. But of course, there's a political question of which sacrifices and who's making them. I'm very aware of those. There's also a political question on top of that. But it is a premise of which I've always disagreed with, this kind of hyper-individualized therapeutic ethos, we could say. I also like what you said about having a common sense of being, common purpose, which is intrinsic or creative, because I think one of the terrible things about even if you go to work and you work in a building instead of working online, one of the terrible things which happens in the modern work life, for example, in both those settings, regardless if you're in person or you're digital, is that everything is kind of instrumentalized.
Yes.
That everyone is an instrument. You are an instrument to produce capital. You are an instrument to, you're just a piece of a machine. There's no sort of innate and intrinsic sense of being or sense of purpose there, which binds it together and gives you, it's more like a collective of individuals rather than a proper group, we could say. And I think that's one of the things that I see with some people that are trying to create a kind of common sense of being, but they're not actually creating a common sense of being. They're creating, and I would talk about, okay, I always joke about, so I used to be kind of more on the left, and I got involved in some political stuff many years ago. And I used to always joke that it was like going to a group therapy meeting. It's like, how did these people turn politics into a group therapy? Like every single time. It's quite incredible. And I think it's because there's a sense of going at collective common struggles and common purposes, with the sense that we're all a kind of herd of individuals. We're not really bound to this one common thing and restricted by it. And there's something imposed on us individually by it to form a whole. We rather want a whole, which is just a reinforcement of individuals. So yeah, any comments on that?
No, I'd say, well,
personally, so before Belonging It, mostly did a lot of fiction. I randomly did like papers on Marx, the Creative Concord, on love. I had a book called Ironically Different. But really it was this problem of what does it mean to create values between a rock and a hard place like you're describing that ends up leading so much into the truism, the rational. And to me, a lot of this gets into the problem of beauty and creativity. Like, I think generally when people like, you know, if I ask you, what is the meaning of your life? Generally, people have no idea. It's very confusing and they're not sure what to do with that. But if I were to ask you, what do you find beautiful? You know, that tends to be a better heuristic. Like, what do you find beautiful? Like, what strikes you and feels like it's more important than you and is bigger than yourself? That tends to be a much better indication of a grounding of community than the question of meaning head on, even though I'm a fan of Viktor Frankl. You mentioned the Nietzsche quote. You know, I think, you know, a man can bear any how with the right why or something. You know, Viktor Frankl would talk about it. And I think that's very good. But the question of is, if you don't know your meaning and I ask you what is your meaning, it can be very confusing, and you can be like well, then it's just a choice. It falls back into the therapeutic that Philip Reiff is talking about. And that's actually what has kind of happened, is where meaning has been absorbed by corporations and different things as part of the therapeutic process. And you find meaning in what is therapeutic, when really you tend to find meaning in what is bigger than yourself and what you fit into. Dallas Willard, to this quote of freedom, he had this great line in one of his books where he said, you know, freedom is not the child who is eating all the candy that he wants or just kind of bashing around the house. You know, freedom is found when you hear an unbelievable performance of Beethoven and you cannot help but rise in your seat and clap your hands out. You know, like freedom is found in that being taken up in something, sort of swoosed up. And really, community, what I think we will find is that communities today are going to need to be in the business of increasing the capacity of its members to see wonder, to see beauty. But you see, this is the funny thing. In order to see beauty as opposed to something pleasant, beauty has always, funny enough, been tied to like the beauty of the battlefield, the beauty of the fighter, the art of the craftsman. Beauty and commitment are strongly tied, and that's tied to risk, and that's tied to the willingness to stand up to something. You know, one of the reasons I like a lot of your work on thymos is because actually, traditionally speaking, it's hard to have beauty without thymos, because you actually have to have that sort of gallantry and courage of standing up to things. Beauty, you know, people will talk in Christianity, the beauty of the cross. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That's like saying the beauty of the electric chair, but it's the beauty of something tied to a greater cosmic order. So for me, you end up getting into the question of beauty, the creation of wonder and stuff like that. This also ties into the kind of the classical trinity of the beauty, the true, and the good. And you need all three. And if you're missing one, you get a lot of trouble. What generally happens is that, say, liberals in America will be very concerned about the good and increasing the good. But you see, and so they'll fight, say, an injustice. And this happened with Occupy Wall Street. But when it comes to, okay, but what are we for, right? Well, there's such a concern of exclusion or keeping someone out or defining yourself in a manner that doesn't allow anyone to be in, and it's viewed as evil to exclude, then your very mission of the good keeps you from creating the necessary conditions of, say, creating something beautiful and a new truth. Right? Like if you think capitalism today is corporatism and it's eating everyone alive, then your movement is trying to create a new truth per se, in which America is not defined by a parasitical corporatism, right? Well, you can't do that unless you form a effective organization. But that would require you to create exclusions that you have defined by your ethical code as being immoral. Therefore, you can have your good, but you can't get the beauty or you can't get the true. The same thing tends to happen with, say, conservatives. Well, they'll say, well, it's true that, you know, America was this way or this, that, and so forth. But they'll utter the truth in a manner that is not necessarily perceived as good by liberals. And sometimes conservatives will not take the time to understand where liberals are speaking from. So they may be speaking a truth, but then they're not speaking in a manner that's good. Or conservatives are so sure that they're defending the truth that when they go down, say, a conspiratorial rabbit hole, they don't examine themselves enough to realize that it's not true, right? So you always have to have all three of those checking and informing one another at all times. A lot of the successful symbolic orders had mechanisms of doing all three. And frankly, they fell into decadence and decline when they lost one of those three. The challenge today is to, since you do not have a symbolic order given to you that maintains those three, is to create one that has those three in play and yet does not feel arbitrary. that feels authoritative and feels like it's actually something there. And this is where someone like me then, stuff about like absolute knowing, the real of Lacan, the creative act of a Berjayev, different things like that seem important. And it also seems like creativity as an organizing principle of community can also give you more decentralization as opposed to centralization, and yet also still have a common core. Because that's the big challenge too, right? Like, how do you get decentralization, but not so much decentralization that it's anarchism, but then also not so much centralization that you're forced by power into sort of a biotechno state that you don't want to be in. So these are all parts of the challenges, I think.
Yeah, great. You mentioned the word symbolic order, and I wanted to bring that up because what I think belonging again seems to be inspired, of course, by Reiff is, as you were saying, a new form of sociology, tragic sociology. But I think that this tragic sociology as well is a sociology which is pushing back a little bit against, I think, a lot of the more materialistic schools of sociology, which go from everywhere and from the bourgeois thinkers, Adam Smith and so on, to Marx, which have really been, I think, in modernity more given more light, given more attention than the more symbolic. And I think the problem with the symbolic stuff, we talk about somebody like Jung, is that then he got involved with a kind of medical pursuit, which then had a premise of the individual being the standard of everything. So then it's no longer sociological. It's individual. It's just psychology. So what seems to me to be necessary, and what Belonging Again seems to be pushing for, is thinking about a kind of symbolic sociology, a kind of sociology of symbols as real things which really determine the way things are. And they're not just the superstructure. They're not just the ideological surface level. They are part of the determining force of how events play out and how the world, how history moves.
That's a very good reading, my friend. Metaphysics are concrete. They matter. Ideas are lenses. If you ignore that, then you have no control out of how the social order organizes. So I mentioned that paper I wrote on Marx. So I would say like one of the first, I guess 2010 papers, it's called The Creative Concord, and it makes the following argument. It says that Marx defines the material dialectic as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the people who own the means of production, the people that create the means of production, and that basically history is the unfolding of this dialectic and the alienation tension of it. The argument of the paper is there's actually there should be a third class. I like to call it the artifacts, and those are the people who make the means of production. And it's precisely because you have a creative class that make the means of production. Anyone in the the reason why Marx was very deterministic. He thought that capitalism had a determined lifespan and that it would eventually blow up. But then, of course, it didn't blow up like he thought it would. And in fact, the majority of communist revolutions are in undeveloped nations as opposed to developed nations, which is the exact opposite of one would expect. And that's where you then get, say, the Frankfurt School saying, well, ideology, capitalist ideology is very good at controlling people, and that's why the revolution didn't occur, and so on and so forth. I'm not critiquing the notion of ideology having that power or anything, but you see, the reason why I think Marx is contingent, not determinist, is because anyone at the proletariat can theoretically create a means of production for themselves. And if you make a means of production, you often work and own the means of production, not just one or the other, or you sell the means of production. And you see, that creates a kind of ventilation system of the alienation, because when people in the proletariat can become artifactian, then they're not inherently alienated. And also that creates the mechanism of creative destruction. And that's where, for me, if you want to understand capitalism, of which is in major decline, but that's an entirely different subject, is the role of creativity in the system, the ability to make means of production, to create technologies like air conditioning that solves problems. But of course, that very technology then can turn into its own force of alienation once you get artificial intelligence. But the main point is where I'm very, very sympathetic to the doctrine of historic materialism, of understanding movements of history in terms of material. But you see, materials don't make themselves. There is some contingent element that arises to materials that then people determine their life around. Like the existence of the computer was not given by history. It was not in the beach. It was not in the rocks. It was not in the mountains. It somehow came out of the human. Now, how did it come out of the human? Seems to be a mixture of mental, physical, coincidental stuff. It's a very mysterious process, but there's some kind of mysterious process that seems to have a big freaking deal on the development of history, of society, culture, how people live their lives and stuff like that. And you cannot say, you see, here's the mistake. The moment I invent the computer, it's now part of your material condition. And you say, oh, humans reflect the material condition. But wait a minute, there was a moment when that material condition was not there. There's kind of a flip moment where something is added that was not found in the previous material condition that's now there and changes everything as if it was always part of the material condition. Do you see what I'm saying? Like there's a switch that occurs that's very easy to mix because the moment I invent something, it's part of the material condition. So it makes it seem like history is just the material condition, you see? But there are these moments of adding to the material condition that are not found in the previous material condition, right? And so those creative moments are not merely material, they are more metaphysical. They are more material reference, metaphysics you can take to mean just the physical referencing the physical and getting a new way of looking at the physical. If I take a piece of paper and fold it in on itself, it's the paper touching the paper, but the space of which allows the folding is not in the paper. But there has to be that space around the paper so that I can fold it. So if the physical is able to reference the physical, that is a physics referencing physics, which is an act that is not reducible to the material because it's the physical looking at the physical, and the looking itself cannot be found in the physical. Now, all of that is to say, this all means that a primary component of the development of society and history is something of which cannot be located in the physical, because the moment it affects the physical, it seems like it's just the physical because the reference itself is invisible. And so for me, this problem of how to develop values between a rock and a hard place, as you put it, is owning that metaphysical act and being intentional about it and forming communities around that. And I think it has the potential of feeling transcended and thus having the power of previous symbolic orders, because it is not something that can be found in the material. And the character of it is very mysterious. And this gets into things like emergentism, absolute knowing, and all of these different things. And so to me, the belonging again is absolutely leading in the direction of having to have a more sophisticated understanding of how society forms. Yes, the material order is stupidly important, but the material order is itself because of ideas that the moment they manifest into the material order make it seem like there's just the material order, but in fact, there's a background that you have to take into account. And look, that becomes kind of clear when we're talking about this pleasure thing. You give people everything they always wanted in their life. You give them all the pleasure, all the money they ever want. And Durkheim found that people who are rich are more likely to commit suicide than people who aren't. How does that work? Unless there's something beyond the material that people are longing for, that they need for belonging, that seems like it's located in the material, but is not. And so, yes, belonging again is absolutely interested in that.